I am thrilled to introduce you to today's speaker and NSA NC friend and colleague, Betty Rhodes, a dynamic force in the worlds of wine and leadership. During her decades of public service, Betty's effective leadership style drove countless transformative initiatives, securing crucial funding and fostering collaboration among diverse organizations and teams. Now, as a certified sommelier and certified champagne specialist, I love champagne, she seamlessly integrates her passion for wine with her expertise in career success, offering a refreshing take on professional growth. Please join me in warmly welcoming Betty as she takes us on an enlightening journey through the world of wine wisdom today. Take it away, Betty.
We're going to talk about wine wisdom, trends, myths, secrets, all of the above. From a standpoint of goals, whenever I do a talk, I always like to talk about what we're going to get out of it. And for today, we're going to talk about what's trending in the wine industry. We're going to bust some myths. Some of you in your introductory questions already talked about some of the myths that persist in the wine industry. We give you some tips to help uh, accelerate, increase your pleasure when you're trying to find a nice bottle to drink. And we'll make sure to have time for questions at the end. So let's get started. So first of all, who am I to be talking to you about all of this? What is a sommelier? So a sommelier is just a wine professional who is trained in the art of selecting, serving, and pairing wines. And it can be in a restaurant, it can be in a retail shop, it can be neither, it can be all of the above. There are definitely opinions about when people should use the term sommelier, but I definitely am more of a big tent inclusive person. If you've done the training, if you've taken the exams, you're a sommelier. It doesn't matter if you're working at a restaurant or not. So this is a fun picture of me. That is literally in the middle of my service section of my certified sommelier exam. I'm happy to answer questions about the process later. Incredibly stressful, but I will say my work as a professional speaker definitely helped in this situation in terms of managing nerves and being able to confidently communicate. But a sommelier is just a fancy French word for someone who is trained in the art of wine. So let's talk about what's going on in the wine industry right now. So in 2024, we obviously have many hundreds, if not thousands of years of wine history to contend with. And we're seeing a lot of shifts. And some of those shifts are consumer driven, some of them are climate driven, as we've discussed. But we've got some different styles and regions that are starting to really break through and get into the mainstream. Everyone knows there's great wine in France, there's great wine in Italy, there's great wine in Germany. That is what has previously really been known as the old world. We're getting away from that sort of uh, phraseology just because there have been places making wine far longer than those places, but we have heretofore sort of distinguished between old world, which is mostly sort of traditional Western Europe, and new world, which includes the United States, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, South America. So what we're seeing is as we get into modern times and as the climate has shifted, we are seeing regions start making wine or start making better wine that hadn't been doing so beforehand. So Eastern Europe is a great example. There are some incredible wines coming out of Hungary, Slovenia, I'm sure Albania. We've got wine being made all across the globe, and some of these newer regions are able to produce in in a less expensive way because the land, which is typically the most expensive part of the winemaking process, is the land, is less expensive in these more emerging economies and countries. So we're seeing new regions like Eastern Europe, South America, South Africa really start to pick up steam. And then we're also looking at different grapes. So grapes that have similar characteristics to sort of our traditional Cabernet, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, the sort of noble grapes, if you will. We're seeing new species that are sometimes native to a geography or just less planted. We're starting to see them come up and be alternatives to some of the higher priced sort of traditional grapes. So that's really exciting as we get more to explore from more places. And our, being a part of a global economy makes that all possible. There's also consumer shifts. We are all, as we know, aging all the time. And so, as people get into drinking age, there are new generations that we're trying to bring into the wine industry. So, we're seeing millennials and Gen Z really heavily influencing the way wine producers are behaving. They have different priorities than perhaps other generations drinking wine. If you all remember when we were in our 20s, you're lucky if you could afford a $20 bottle versus folks who are much more established in their lives and their careers who can invest, who can cellar those things, who can really start collecting and appreciating. And so, one of the real challenges, I think, for the wine industry right now is being inclusive of some of these newer consumers and not being so stuck on the old way of doing things. And that's been a very painful shift for the industry so far. It continues to be. So we're going to have to see if some of the kind of new emerging leaders in the industry are willing to take this on. The younger generations are concerned with things like sustainability, like climate change, like environmental responsibility in the winemaking process. But as you may have seen, and we'll talk about this in a second as well, a lot of younger generations are not drinking at all. They are choosing to be alcohol free. And that comes from a variety of different places. But you've heard of dry January. Maybe you haven't heard of sober October. All of these different movements to moderate or eliminate alcohol from the diet, they impact obviously all of the beverage industry, but wine in particular seems to have a harder time with this. You've probably seen, if not enjoyed, non-alcoholic beers. Non-alcoholic spirits even have gotten really, really good. We have not figured out non-alcoholic wine. Most of it is terrible. And so again, it's really this resistance to trying to create products that will get people in the door. And that really is what the industry is struggling with. Technology has made wine easier and easier to find and enjoy. So there's a million apps for keeping track of your cellar, for finding hard to locate bottles, for reviews. It's not just the Robert Parkers and the critics anymore who have a say. We've sort of crowdsourced reviews about wine across the globe. And so there's more information available to consumers than ever before. AI. I went to a sommelier conference last month, and there were tons of sessions on how we can leverage AI to improve the industry, to make things more efficient. These are all things that every part of the wine industry really needs to grapple with if we're going to survive into the future. We have to take advantage of these shifts, take advantage of these new technologies instead of latching on to the way we always did it before. And it's going to be a continuing process. One quick note, one big conversation that's happening in the wine industry has to do with a statement from the WHO, the World Health Organization, back in January of 2023. So they released a report where they said no level of alcohol consumption is safe for our health. And as you can imagine, that's a pretty powerful statement coming from the WHO. And so the wine industry has been very, very concerned with this, not just the wine industry, the beverage in general. But what I want to remind people is what the WHO has not really incorporated into this statement is the social benefit. We talked about this a little bit in the introductions. Part of wine is about gathering with people and bringing people together over a shared experience. And there are definitive health benefits to those kinds of gatherings, but it really wasn't factored into that statement. So unfortunately, that statement has done a lot of damage. And I think that, one of the big tasks that the wine industry is going to have to tackle in the very near future is how can we better study and understand some of those more tangential health benefits to drinking wine. So stay tuned for all of that. But that has really caused a significant amount of consternation in the industry, and it continues to really drive a lot of conversations. So I share this. This is a consumer choice survey that was done in spring of 2023, and it really laid out what is important to consumers in three major markets, so US, Australian, and Italian. What do they find important when it comes to choosing a wine? And I think this is really interesting because I think this is going to, this has some really good intel for folks in the industry for opportunities for growth. So you can see, tried it before and liked it, very reliable in importance, and that makes total sense. We don't like uncertainty. We want to know that what we're paying for is going to be good and that we're going to be satisfied. But I think the rest of it is really interesting from the standpoint of, a lot of wine professionals think that the grape variety is what drives decisions or how many awards it's won. What the Robert Parker, is it a 90 point or is it a 95 point? But I think what you see here is that it's so much more than that. And so, what we have to do as wine professionals, and something that I work with the industry on, is how can we take this information and other data like it and use it to communicate the story of a wine? And that, to me, is the bigger role of the sommelier. It's not just about tasting, it's about telling the right story and connecting people to the right wine for the right moment, whether that is a celebratory moment or a somber moment or anything in between. But I think it's also interesting to see that, US consumers find, for instance, region or country of origin to be not terribly important, 28 out of 100. But then you go over to Italy, and Italy says, no, that's 68 out of 100 importance. And that's because that sort of philosophy of the wine reflecting a place, terroir is basically what we refer to it as, is more important in Italy. And that makes sense when you think about their winemaking tradition. I think we've seen increases in sort of packaging that goes along with the sustainability and the environmental protection piece of this. But I just think this is some really interesting data that shows us that there is a lot more that goes into selecting a bottle of wine than just the label or the price or any one component. This is a slide that hurts me. It really hurts me. So
Hello?
this is the number one new wine in the United States in 2023. It is a Stella Rosa pineapple chili wine. And a wine professional, a wine connoisseur, is probably going to have that same visceral reaction, which is, oh my gosh, like what? That is not what I consider to be good wine. But this is where we have to kind of open our minds. I love this. They over index. So they really focus their product development in that early age group. So just when you're legally able to drink up until sort of mid 30s. So that entry level group. So they over index and they price and develop based on those preferences. But what I think is even more interesting is that this big percentage of Stella Rosa's sales in 2023 came from first time wine drinkers. These are people who are just getting into the industry. And we have to welcome that. Uh, there's nothing that's going to be able to stop you from being judgy in your head. We're human beings, we're judgmental creatures. So it is what it is. But we should see in this an opportunity to communicate and tell better wine stories to these consumers so that we can move them into different additional categories of wine. But I just think this is really important, really interesting that a flavored wine product was the number one new wine product last year. I have never had it, so I'm not going to be able to speak. I'm not going to be able to speak to it. So let's talk about some of the myths that persist in the wine industry. And that first one is price equals quality. If it's a more expensive bottle, it's got to be better, right? Negative. So we've talked already a little bit about all the different costs that go into winemaking, and land is one of the most important things. So, of course, you're going to have more expensive production costs in Napa, in Bordeaux, in these places that are well known, that have already had enough time to build a premium reputation. But there are a lot of other places that you can get wine where it's a lot more affordable. And so the price is going to reflect that. The other big thing is marketing. So a teeny tiny percentage of the wine industry does the majority of the marketing. Most wine companies don't do a lot of marketing. But the ones that do, that's a huge additional cost. And so it's something to think about when you're looking at the price of a bottle and think about all the things that go into it. But it really does, there is no point at which there's a direct correlation between price and quality. And so those of you who have $15, $20 bottles that you love, amazing. My favorite thing when I worked in a retail shop was people who came in with the budget and said, I want to buy something like XYZ, but I only have $20. Those are my favorite customers because I don't have unlimited revenue for wine. I also have to watch my spending. And so when I can find a wine that punches above its weight, price wise, it's a great day. And there's a lot of ways that you can do that. So don't ever think that just because a wine is inexpensive, that it's not going to be high quality and vice versa. All right, we talked about it in the intro. Red wine with meat, white wine with fish. It is a rule that I don't know who first came up with it, but that's something we've stuck with for years and years and years and years. And it's not necessarily wrong. I think what I want to communicate to you with respect to food pairings is there are multiple different philosophies that you can use when you're deciding about pairing. So you got to have flexibility. So what we really need to think about isn't what's the protein, and this matches definitively with this one grape. It's more, what are the flavor profiles? What are the textures? What's the acidity? What's the fat? And there are two main schools of wine and food pairing. One is a complementary pairing. I refer to this as what grows together goes together. So things that come from the same area are always going to be good pairings. Somebody who mentioned champagne and oysters. That's a great example. The soil in Champagne is this Kimmeridgian soil that has fossilized shellfish bits all in it. So there's a salinity and a minerality that pairs beautifully with champagne and oysters because they have a lot of the same components. That's a complementary pairing. Something like goat cheese and Sancerre, that's another one where you've got a high acid wine and a high acid cheese, and they are harmonious together. That's a complementary pairing, but there's also a contrasting pairing. If you've got something, really, really rich, and fatty. Maybe you don't want a big, bold red. Maybe you want something that's going to cut it, that's going to be different, that's going to give you a contrasting feeling in your palate. So there really isn't a right or wrong way to do it, but you can think about whether you want to, highlight certain components or keep them in the background, and that will help you determine whether you want to do a complementary or a contrasting pairing. The other thing that I love to share is champagne is a great food pairing cheat. Champagne is great at everything, but champagne pairs with virtually anything. So if you're stuck about what to pair with a particular dish, champagne is always a great fallback position. And any day that you're drinking champagne is a good day in my book. So the things that you want to think about again with food pairing, less about the protein and more about, what's being served with it, what's the sauce, what is the spice level, and kind of start going from there. And you're not going to have a sommelier show up at your table and revoke, take away your glass if you order Cabernet with fish or Chardonnay with a steak. At the end of the day, whoever said it earlier, the best glass of wine is the one you're enjoying. I'm sorry, there we go. All right. So next up, aging. All wines get better with age. I wish it were so. That would be so easy to keep in your brain. But there are wines that aren't going to benefit from aging. Only a small percentage of wines, estimated about 10% of all the wine that's made in any given moment, can really improve with age. And so, things to take into account when you're deciding whether to save a wine or drink it new, fresh, young. If it's a high acid or high tannin wine, acids and tannins kind of act as preservatives in this case and can sort of gradually mellow out over age to create sort of a more elegant feel and taste and structure. So things like Cabernet Sauvignon, things like Nebbiolo, these are high acid, high tannin red wines, and they are going to continue to improve over the course of years. Sweet wines, also similarly, the sugar can act like a preservative. And so you can keep things like Sauterne, Tokai, some of those ice wines that we mentioned from Canada, those can evolve over time because of that natural sweetness. Alcohol content, fortified wines, so things like sherry and port, those are also wines. They have higher alcohol content, so they can last longer and can again be able to change over the course of time. On the flip side, there's lots of wine that is meant to be drunk young. So going back to sparkling wine, champagne has a lot of great aging potential. Prosecco, not so much. Prosecco is meant to be drunk young. The grape that's used to make Prosecco is called Glera. It is meant to be a lighter, fruitier, not sweeter necessarily, but a little bit more aromatic. And that is meant to be drunk sooner rather than later. Crisp whites, like a Pinot Grigio, like a Sauvignon Blanc, those are going to be amazing right out of the gate. And they're not necessarily going to be aging and getting better. You definitely only want to age the wine if it's going to get better. So rosé, definitely meant to be drunk young and fresh. And even some light reds. So tomorrow is Beaujolais Nouveau Day. It's the date that a very particular wine out of Beaujolais in France gets released, always gets released the third Thursday of November. That's a light red that's meant to be drunk young. It's supposed to taste fresh and fruity. And if you prefer your wines fresh and fruity, drink them that way. There's nothing that says that you have to age a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Nebbiolo if you like them when they're fresher. If you can, what I always recommend is get a couple of bottles of the same thing. Drink one now, drink one in a year, drink one in 5 years. And jot down your thoughts. It's going to change over time. And then you can start determining at what point you really feel like it hits the peak for you. Everyone's palates are different. If you're ever in doubt, open the bottle, drink the good wine. Life's too short. Don't let some, nebulous concept of aging stop you from drinking a good wine. A good wine is a good wine, whatever day you choose to enjoy it. All right, closures and packagings. We still have stigma around a screw cap. And I think you know what I'm going to say, which is there is not a quality line that's drawn between a screw cap and the wine that it is closing. What we're cork is the industry standard still, and corks definitely have some pluses. It's a natural product. It does actually allow for some air, teeny bits of air to get into the bottle, which can help with the aging process. Um, and they're traditional, and there's something like sensory wise that's really lovely about popping a cork out of a bottle of wine. The screw cap is definitely not as satisfying. There's no sound, there's no equipment that there's no showing off with a screw top, but they can create an airtight seal. So if you don't want any air to get into your wine, which generally we don't, uh, it can create a more airtight seal. It can help you eliminate some of the faults that can come into wine due to oxygen. And from a climate standpoint and from a sustainability standpoint, screw caps are better on the environment. Cork production has been down and it has gotten more expensive, and that cost gets passed on to the consumer, but it's also a cost to the planet, which the industry is also really working on being a better partner of the planet. So don't ever not purchase a bottle because it has a screw top opening. And you're going to see New Zealand and Australia in particular, even their most premium wines are often under a screw top. They have really embraced that, and there is no correlation between quality and the type of closure that there is. I would also let you know that because of climate change, because of some of these sustainability concerns, we are seeing some winemakers go back to things that, again, would have tipped you off to bad mass produced wine before. So, boxed wine. There are incredibly premium producers putting their wines in bag in box format because it is easier to transport, it's less expensive, and it's better for the planet to be able to use those highly recyclable materials. So don't ever let the packaging deter you. And if you ever have a question, just ask your local wine professional. So these myths, these rules, they can all be broken. Just like in any industry, you have to sometimes push a little bit to make that progress. All right. So some tools of the trade in terms of how to be better at selecting and understanding and enjoying wine. So let's talk about the labels. And I could do 4 hours on wine labels. I will not. But I think the biggest thing that you need to know about wine labels is, again, going to that old world versus new world setup. So the vast majority of old world wines, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, Austria, they label their wines based on where they come from versus which grape variety it is. So when you hear, for instance, someone say Rioja, Tony, I think you mentioned in the chat that you are a fan of Rioja, as am I. Rioja is not the grape, it's the place. And there's nothing generally on the bottle that tells you what the grape is. They just expect you to know that Rioja means Tempranillo. And similarly in Burgundy, for instance, when you see red Burgundy, it's Pinot Noir. But I know that because I studied it. The average person doesn't know it. And so this is why, European wine often is seen as so overwhelming and so difficult to understand. But this is where having a really good trusted wine shop and wine professional can be helpful because you can pick these things up. They are the ones who will know. But that is all to say it's understandable if the old world labels are confusing because they're kind of meant to be. And that really, it wasn't a snooty thing. It wasn't anything like that. It really is just so much more in Europe than here. Wines are about a specific regional style versus a grape. Chardonnay in Chablis is gonna be very different from Chardonnay from uh, uh, from elsewhere in Burgundy. So it's the same grape, but they're going to have wildly different profiles because of where they come from and the different ways of winemaking that they use. Um, some of the old world producers are adding more information to the labels to sort of help consumers, not all. Um, but just know that when you're going into Europe, that's typically what you're going to be seeing. Now, and there are all kinds of laws about all of that, but that's kind of the basics. When it comes to the new world, we do it the other way. We typically put the grape on the bottle, on the label. And that is, again, it has less to do with any kind of sort of pretense, but more to do with the fact that we're talking to consumers in different ways and we're assuming a different level of knowledge. Wine has been such a huge part of European life for thousands of years that there kind of is already, it's just a different starting point than, for instance, in Chile or in Oregon. But New World labels tend to be straightforward. The thing that I would caution you about is that they are a lot more strict in Europe, in the old world, about the things that you can say on a bottle. So if you see, for instance, Gran Reserva on a bottle of Rioja, that's going to tell you a certain piece of information about how long that bottle has been aged. If you see Reserve here on a California Cabernet, doesn't mean anything. It's marketing. And so in the New World, it's a little bit easier to sort of get swayed by these kind of fancy marketing terms. So just keep that in mind. And again, if you ever have those questions, your local wine professional is such a great resource to be able to help navigate those things. So when you taste, there is more to it than just bottoms up. So the first thing we're going to do in the tasting process, if you're a sommelier, you are going to look at the wine. What color is it? How pigmented is it? That's going to tell you something about the wine. It's going to tell you something about what you're about to taste. Then you're going to swirl. We don't swirl just to look fancy. We swirl because it activates aromas that are going to come out of the glass. It gets a little bit of oxygen in there and it sort of agitates things to release compounds that you will get in your nose. And your nose is as much of an important part of tasting, if not more, than your actual taste buds on your tongue. So we're going to see, we're going to swirl, we're going to sniff. And when we sniff, we put our full nose. Don't be precious about it. Put your full nose into the glass and take a big whiff. Then take a short whiff. However you want to get that, but it's really important that you get those aromas up into your nasal passages because that helps you taste. And then you sip, and you can keep everybody has advice on like the noise that your mouth is supposed to make when you're doing tasting. I find all of those noises to be off-putting. So whatever noise you make, that's on you. But it really is just about, coat your palate. Let it let it sit on your tongue, let it kind of fill your mouth, and don't just, chug a lug. At least not for the first sip, so that you can really get a sense of it. Um, See, swirl, sniff, sip. Those are the 4 steps for tasting wine like a sommelier. What about those headaches? I heard a couple people mention headaches in our introductory question. So there has been a lot of junk science about wine headaches. And I'm sad to tell you that uh, there isn't just one source. There is still a lot of study happening on this issue right now. But typically, one thing that people misunderstand is sulfites. Sulfur is an integral part of the winemaking process. Most winemakers use it in minimal amounts, but it's a very important sort of preservative to ensure that the wine doesn't have major flaws. And a glass of wine probably has less sulfites than most things that you would think. So dried fruit, French fries, there's all kinds of food items that have sulfites in larger quantities than wine. It is generally not the sulfites that are giving you the headache. Generally speaking, your headache is coming because you're not drinking enough water. It's a hydration issue. There are some people, a very small percentage of the population, who have actual sulfite allergies and kind of intolerances, but that is not most people. So I would say if you have put off red wine because you think it's giving you headaches, and you're willing to do some experimenting, try it with maybe a smaller portion of the wine and drinking water immediately before and after. I know for me, I have chronic migraine, and I used to think that red wine was a huge contributing factor to that. And it can be, but I have found that when I drink red wine, if I'm hydrating properly, there's not an issue. So new studies are linking the headaches to histamines that are in wine, but we're still kind of waiting for more definitive answers. But just know that probably your wine headache is from drinking too much wine and not enough water. And I'm all for drinking all the wine, but you got to hydrate as well. Temperature matters. Your serving temperature for wine, generally, we serve white wine too cold and red wine too warm. So, temperatures for whites, you should aim for serving white wines between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, red wines between 55 and 64 Fahrenheit. But I would say that both have some flexibility. You can, when you warm a white wine, it's going to help bring out new different textures and aromas and flavors. It's going to change as it comes up to temperature. Same thing for red wine. If you start your red wine with a little bit of a chill on it, you're going to get a different flavor as you go through the glass as it comes up to temperature. I love starting a red wine a little cooler than you would think, and then kind of watching how it changes. Those are sort of the ideal serving temperatures. There's always flexibility just with all these other rules. So, my best tips in terms of how you can buy and drink more better wine is find a shop and a shopkeeper that you trust. So, if you're in the Bay Area, uh, there are some really great shops. We are super lucky in the Bay Area to have access to so much good stuff. So I suggest K&L. K&L has multiple locations throughout California. They have a huge selection. Also, spirits. They're wonderful. They deliver. I don't think they ship nationwide, but if you're in the Bay Area or near one of their stores elsewhere in California, they have a great delivery program. Verve is where I used to work. Verve is a wine shop in San Francisco. It's in Pacific Heights. They also have one in Chicago and in New York. Really sort of smaller, curated selection. A company was started by a master sommelier. So really focusing on lesser known producers, smaller producers. If you're in the East Bay, Kermit Lynch. Kermit Lynch is a legendary wine importer. He wrote a book about his time on the wine trail as an importer, and it's fascinating. I highly recommend it. But Kermit Lynch has a shop in Berkeley, I believe. Excuse me. That would also be a great place to go. But just generally, Total Wine is not where you're going to get the best education necessarily, nor are you going to get sort of a person that you can rely on. There's a lot more turnover at sort of the big box shops. So if you can find a local neighborhood wine shop, that is a great place to start. Most of them have tasting events and educational things that you can get involved with. And if you build a good relationship with your local wine shop, they can often get you things that maybe they don't sell, but if you ask them for it, they'll bring in a case for you. And so it's really good to have that relationship, and they can help you, if they know you like wine A, okay, wine B has some similar things, and let me recommend and help you expand your palate. So I can't recommend enough having a good wine shop up your sleeve. This is one of my favorite quotes about wine. Uh, it really, again, we cannot say enough about the social and emotional benefits of gathering over a shared experience. And so for me, that's what it all boils down to is, yes, what am I drinking, but also who am I drinking it with? What's the occasion? What's going on in our lives and in the world? And what are we going to remember with this bottle? You know, I think, again, we're fortunate. We live in a time when we have tons of delicious wine available to us. Um, but that's not the most important part. Not the most important part. The most important part is finding a way to enjoy it with people that you care about while having vibrant conversation about whatever topics are important to you. And so that's kind of how I view things in wine. So the other way to get to know wine better is to drink more of it. So it's called practice. Or if you are a fan of uh, South Park, there's also this. Oh, my little sound is not working. But yeah, he says, I'm not having a glass of wine. I'm having six. It's called a tasting and it's classy. So that's the best way to get more out of your drinking wine is just to do more of it with more folks that you love. So I'm going to stop sharing and I can answer any questions that you have. So much wine to get through.
Rip, you have something to say.
Well, as you know, I don't drink wine. However, I found your presentation fascinating, well delivered, and truly interesting. Especially, I'd never realized if the food grows near where the grapes grow. I mean, just I feel I could add some sophisticated comments at a cocktail party where I'm not drinking, thanks to you. Really
Excellent.
appreciate your contribution. And it's so good to hear an expert who's a good speaker speak on any subject, even if you didn't think you had a lot of interest in it. Fabulous. Thank you very much. And it's good to see Harriet Stein, who was one of our other speakers a couple of months ago, joining us. And we do have some members who joined us late. Claudette Good O'Neill, who always has a coaching client when we're chatting, and Don Persky, our board member. So with that, I have to run and meet my travel partner. But thank you, Betty, and back to you, Carl. Thank you very much. Thank you, Betty.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to add to what she said. I've been having fun studying wine for some years now, and it really is the perfect marriage of art and science. And I it's fascinating. And the different soils and the different grapes, all of it. It's just it's so complex. You'll never get through all of it. Okay, do we have any questions?
Susan has her hand up, Carl.
Susan, yes.
Betty, this was fabulous. So my question is, how much did you have to drink to do such a good presentation?
Well, I will say I drink wine not every day, but most days, and try to keep my skills up. But this stuff is just so interesting to me. I could talk about it for hours and hours and hours. Um, and again, a lot of it just has to do less with the actual drinking and more with just sort of the gathering of people that happens anytime someone opens a bottle and pours. I tend not to drink by myself because I feel like that uh kind of defeats the purpose for me, which is a very much a social
And
purpose.
and the research on the social versus the loneliness. And I'm the person that will have a cup of hot water, officially turned into my grandmother, while everyone has wine. So the truth is, you don't have to have wine to do it, but be around people. But what you said about a trusted person, when I came back from New Zealand, schlepping Marlboro, my guy said Marlboro has the best marketing, and he said Thornberry um, is as good. And then he said something interesting. If you really want a Cabernet Sauvignon, our very own out of Rutherford, Honig
Hmm.
was good. He used to be the school superintendent of San Francisco, so that cracked me up. But having someone who could say, yeah, that's got better marketing, this is as good. So thank
Yeah.
you. And I do try to stay up on wines because they bring them as gifts, but I just can't drink them because they don't work for me. But thank you. I have taken 3 pages of notes.
Excellent.
Okay, Claudette.
Hi, with all this global warming, if we keep a bottle of red wine in the refrigerator and we don't want it to serve it really cold, how long would you recommend we leave it out? Or does the refrigeration process ruin it?
No, refrigeration's not going to ruin it. If you get close to freezing, you're going to have problems, but a typical refrigerator should be fine. Um, I would say, depending on sort of how you like your wine and depending on what specific wine it is, anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours before you want to enjoy it. If you're like me and you want to kind of start enjoying it with a little bit of a chill on it and see how it changes, closer to the 30-minute mark. If you'd like to get it more to room temp, more like 2 hours for a red. That's kind of the guideline that I usually use.
Does it make a difference between how bold the red is?
Yeah, it does. I think, you'll need less time for like a lighter red to come to temperature. Um, so a Pinot Noir is going to take less time to kind of come up than a big bold Cab or a Zinfandel. But I generally feel like we serve white wine too cold and red wine too warm. So skewing a couple of degrees in those directions can help the enjoyment.
Well, since
Great.
you've said that, if I have the white wine in the refrigerator, how much time on the counter should it have before I
I don't think
say,
you need to keep, yeah, I don't think you need to keep white wine on the counter, but do pay attention to how it evolves in the glass. Because as soon as you pour it, it's going to start coming up in temperature. And with white wine, that's part of the fun is that it changes a little bit in character as it comes up in temperature. But no, you don't need to pull white wine out beforehand.
Okay.
thank you.
Mhm.
All right, great. Michael Milstein, yes.
Yes, Benny, excellent presentation. There was an article recently in the Wall Street Journal about a new fad in the wine industry featuring lower calorie and lower alcohol content wines
Mhm.
that very, very few are outstanding. Are there any that you particularly recommend?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And this, again, it goes along with, millennials, Gen Z, these younger generations are wanting low and no alcohol options. Um, so there's not much I can recommend on the no alcohol front. I saw a comment in there too. Like, I don't know why the wine industry hasn't figured this out. There's so many great non-alcoholic beers, and non-alcoholic wine is primarily garbage. But there are some wines that are like naturally lower in alcohol. So definitely whites tend to be lower in alcohol than reds. Champagne and sparkling wine usually sit kind of about a 12%. And that's fairly low alcohol. Sometimes sparkling wine feels like a more aggressive beverage because of the carbonation. So it hits you a little bit different. But things like Riesling, things like Gruner Veltliner, Gewürztraminer, some of the lighter, more aromatic whites are going to be just naturally closer to kind of like the 10 to 12% alcohol range, which is on the lower side. Wine in general is a lower alcohol beverage than most, so you're already kind of going in the right direction there. But this is definitely something that the wine industry is going to have to reckon with. If they cannot make quality, low and no alcohol products, they are going to lose a huge segment of the market.
It's also really important to remember beer has maybe half the alcohol, but you drink a lot more beer than you do wine. So yeah, it's a larger deal.
Yeah.
Okay, Tony.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Betty. You answered a lot of my questions. When I was walking across Spain, almost all the red wine was chilled, and that's the Tempranillo because that was mostly going through the Rioja region. And I prefer my Pinot Noir and Tempranillo to start chilled myself. But I also was at one of the wineries with a friend of mine who travels France and Germany, knows wine well, but he was talking to one of the wineries there about Sauvignon, Cabernet Sauvignon smelling like cat pee. Uh,
Mhm.
is that
Yeah.
true? Some of it pretty much, the ones I t tested did.
Yeah, there are a number of what we call wine faults that can
Hmm.
create those less tasty notes in wine. Generally speaking, they're not going to harm you, but they're just not going to be pleasant. So cat pee is one of them. Like wet, moldy cardboard is another. Cork
Spunk.
taint.
Yeah.
Cork taint is
Yeah.
one of the downsides of doing a cork closure. That is when you can taste that kind of wet cardboard, like wet dog. Um, and these are all things that anything that has to do with sort of flavors in wine, people tend to scratch their head and they're like, well, how you've never had cat pee before. How do you know what it tastes
Mhm.
like? And it really is just, one of the biggest things you can do to sort of enhance your wine, enhance your palate is obviously drink more wine and note the flavors, but also go smell and taste the real things that you're getting. So, like for instance, you can be fancy. They have these aroma kits, these wine aroma kits, where they have little bottles, vials of essential oils reflecting a lot of the common flavors that you'll see in wine. So you can sort of practice training your nose to pull those out. Um, but you can also just, next time you're at the grocery store, pick up some produce and sniff it, and then go back and see, what you're picking up in your wines. It's just like anything else. It's muscle memory, it's training. When people ask about my sommelier exam, there's three components. There's a written theory component, there's a tasting component, and then there's a service component. And in the tasting component, we had two white wine at the certified level. There's two white and two red, and you have to identify them blind. So grape, region, vintage, um, to the most granular level that you can, and truly you have to train your senses to be able to do that on the regular. And so again, drinking more wine definitely helps with it. But then you can also kind of go find things in the real world and tie them back. That makes
Okay,
sense.
great. Gordon and then Richard.
Oh, wonderful program, Betty. I quit drinking wine in 1987, but when we lived in California in the 60s, I have two tips for people who want to find wines you won't find in the wine store. Visit nearby wineries, go to their tasting rooms, buy what you love, but then ask them, do you make any wines that you don't sell retail outside the store? Louis Martini used to sell a white dessert wine, Moscato dei Canelli, which is just wonderful. But the only place you could get it is in the store. And you don't have to live in California. There are wineries in every state. Visit your local wineries, taste their wine, buy what you love.
Yeah, Gordon,
Great.
that's such a good point. There is wine being made in every single one of the 50 states.
Oh, and one other thing. My wife and I toured Napa Valley in the late 60s and took our two children who were like 8 and 10. And after about the sixth winery where we tasted wine and they got grape juice, my daughter in the back of the car said, "Dad, could we visit a Pepsi plant?"
There you go. Yeah, a fine vintage of Pepsi. Yes.
Yeah, and
Uh,
it's funny, Gordon, because the wine industry kind of generally sales are down, sales and consumption is down. But the one area where we have seen growth is in direct to consumer. So the consumer going direct to the winemaker and purchasing, whether it's through a wine club or going to the winery. People are moving away from big box stores and more into buying directly from the maker, which I think is a good thing. Um, but that is an area where we are seeing some promising data.
by the way, I've tried that pineapple wine.
Ooh.
Uh, here in Hawaii, of course, it's readily available. You know what? Chilled on a hot day, it's not that bad. It's
Oh,
not that bad.
Carl, I will take your word for it.
Okay. Okay, Richard.
We swirl a wine to release the aroma. Red wines, I understand, is it as important with white wines?
Yes. Yes. There are all kinds of secondary and tertiary aromas that you can get, particularly for a white that has a bit of age on it. So yes, it is just as important. And I think almost for white wine, even more so because of the cooler temperature. The cooler temperature is not going to naturally, make those aromas jump out of the glass. So the swirling almost is more important for the whites, just to kind of get it agitated and get it working.
Mhm.
I have another question.
Okay.
Uh,
Yes, Susan.
Betty, when I stopped drinking red wine, it wasn't because of sulfites. It was because of, at the time, we thought tannins.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I never drank a lot, having learned my lesson early in life. So it wasn't about hydrating. Um, there's also something else, taste buds. I don't like the red wines. And I've had people say, "Oh no, you'll love this one. Taste this one." Reminded me of, "Oh, please have one more. Try Brussels sprouts." When people try to force you to have what they like, it really doesn't add to the social.
Yeah.
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 I had that experience. I am not a fan of sweet wines. It's just my palate is not calibrated that way. And Riesling, even when it's made in a dry style, can sometimes come off as sweet. And for years, I've come much more around to them now, having consumed more of them. But I had a friend who, for years and years and years, oh, try this Riesling. It's not sweet. And every single one of them, I was like, nope, hard pass. Uh, so yeah, again, drink what you like. Don't let anybody force you.
All right, we've got Janelle and then Bill.
Janelle, you're muted.
And Benny, this is so impressive. The depth of your knowledge, the scope of your knowledge is how long did it take for you to get to this point?
So actively preparing and studying, I would say, uh, going on 3 years. I've been drinking wine much longer, and I worked in the restaurant industry for a long time when I was younger, so those parts of it came a little earlier. I I first started talking about getting a certification. So my brother-in-law is a Michelin-starred chef in San Francisco. And when my husband and I started talking about moving to the Bay Area from DC, my brother-in-law suggested, "Hey, you might want to get some formal wine education because obviously it's a big deal in the Bay Area and there might be some career opportunities for you." And so in February of 2022, I started taking my introductory sommelier certification, and I went through the Court of Master Sommeliers, which is just one of the accrediting bodies. Um, so I took the introductory level, started preparing in February, took the test that August and passed, and then started preparing for my certified. Um, the introductory level is just a written test. The certified, as I mentioned, has written test, tasting, and service. So I started preparing for that August of 2022. I took the exam in September of 2023. So it took me about a year to prepare. The next level up with the court is an advanced sommelier. They really want you to be working in the industry to do that. So I probably will not pursue that certification. But then I just last month got certified as a champagne specialist, and that was more of sort of an intensive course versus a long process. But there is always more to learn. I will study this for the rest of my life and still not know everything. And there's something comforting about that in some way, that there's always going to be something new and interesting. I am an inherently curious person, and that helps studying this, because it all just feeds more curiosity.
Well, it's impressive. It's very impressive.
Thank you.
Yeah. It takes a long time, but the homework is terrific.
Yeah.
Now, Bill and Betty, Taish, and Tony, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up after that.
Betty, I'll echo the other comments about your comprehensive and very uh, useful information about the wine industry. As I mentioned in the introduction, Claire and I decided a couple of years ago to stop, consuming alcoholic beverages for various reasons. One is that she had a stroke a couple of years ago. However, that did not slow her down from keeping the dogs in Marin happy with her organic biscuits, and the humans with her sea salted chocolate caramels. So for that. Anyway, so at social events, you'll see us. I'll have a non-alcoholic beer. You'll have a virgin margarita. So, but that has not stopped our delight in hearing about the wine industry and knowing that we're in a wine growing area. As I mentioned, we had lunch with a client who is actually, the Rose Ranch actually produces the grapes for the wineries. So he sells grapes. So anyway, my question is this. Prior to our change of household policy 2 years ago, I always, every year, I point out to Claire, I say, look, here's another report from a credible medical source that says moderate consumption of alcoholic beverages, especially beer and wine, leads to longevity beyond those of a comparable survey group that don't. I said, see, we're on the right road. We're doing this, keep, having a glass of wine at dinner every day. So that your report about food just blindsided. That's a 180 out of a previous, understanding about the benefits of consuming moderately, of course. Mainly beer and wine, I think. Can you comment on that? What caused that 180 change?
I don't know 100%. I definitely know that, the alcohol lobby is strong, but the anti-alcohol lobby is also strong. And, ultimately, these are human decisions that get made by people who have biases. And, I think it's, just like I remember back in 2020, March of 2020, we started hearing about this illness that was happening, this COVID thing. And I remember saying and hearing people say, well, until the WHO calls it a pandemic, we're not going to worry about it. And then, of course, the WHO called it a pandemic, and then, we know where that led. But I think the wine industry response really has been, they were blindsided too. So everybody was blindsided by this. And I think, again, it's really almost borderline irresponsible to release a statement like that without also studying some of these other impacts from a social and sort of human standpoint. I don't totally know. I assume that it was, a combination of factors, but I think what we do now, it's already out there. The cat's out of the bag. You can't unring the bell. The WHO has said this thing. And so now as an industry, it's our job to, number one, be more transparent about what's going into the products, and try to, do some studying and highlighting of, of some of the benefits that may not be as obvious. And again, to focus on that moderation piece. But yeah, it was a very this was still like number one topic of conversation at the conference that I was at last month, which is how are we going to combat this narrative?
Yeah.
Is there a
Well,
report somewhere you can get online where you can read the
Yeah, I
verdict?
think so. Yeah, I think so. I'll see what I can find. I can send it around.
yeah. Now the WHO did such a fine job on COVID, waiting 6 months to announce the obvious, that they've lost a lot of credibility with me. So
Yeah.
anyway, Betty.
Hi, Betty, what a great presentation. Very, very informative. Quick question, and you may have covered it. I had to step away for a minute. White wine, how long can you keep it? I have a huge closet full of wine, and sometimes they get hidden. And so we open up bottles, and Rich and I often throw them out because they're too old. I know it depends on the quality, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So two things. So you're not, things like Prosecco, Pinot Grigio, your super light, high acid, your super light, not necessarily high acid whites, but things that are meant to be drunk young. Um, as long as you are keeping them properly temperature controlled, you're not going to lose a ton. Um, but flavors might get more muted. If it's not really an age-worthy wine, flavors might get more muted. It just might not be as dynamic of a product, but you're not necessarily hurting anything or doing anything, quote unquote, wrong. But it's absolutely critical that the wines be stored at the proper temperature and ideally horizontally, not vertically stored,
Yeah.
because that keeps everything. Yeah. For better, more age-worthy wines, you can keep them decades. I have some whites in my cellar now that my wine fridge in my 2-bedroom apartment, let's be real. I have some that, could evolve for 20 years.
Wow.
Just, but the key is just making sure that they're properly stored. And the good news about the Bay Area is that, we don't get as many extreme temperatures as some other parts of the country. But the other downside is most of us don't have air conditioning. So when we do get those extreme temperatures, there's no way to protect the wines from being spoiled, being damaged by those higher temperatures. So, but yeah, whites are pretty, they don't have the tannic structure that reds do, but most of them can hang out for a while.
Thank you so
Okay.
much. Okay,
Mhm.
got it.
Well, Mark and Mark Twain did say that he spent a winter in San Francisco one summer. So, Tony.
Yeah, we've talked about reds and whites. I was going to a dinner party, I think at Betty's and Rich's, and I stopped at the Spanish table in Mill Valley and saw a green wine. I think it was a Verde or something like that.
Ah.
What is the green wine? Is that, I'm sure it's not green grapes, but it could be. What is that? It was very tasty.
Well, Vinho Verde is actually it's a Portuguese specialty. It's actually a great option for a lower alcohol, like what I call them porch pounders. Those are the like real light, low alcohol whites that are just perfect for a summer day out on the porch or at the park. But no, Vinho Verde is a Portuguese wine. It does have a slight green tint to it just because it's really light um, in the glass, but it's barely carbonated. So you get like a little bit of effervescence, but it's not like a fully carbonated like a champagne or a prosecco. Vino Verde is delicious, usually incredibly wallet friendly, and the ones that we can get here in the U.S. are usually really good. I'm a big fan. I thought you were going to ask me about orange wine, which is probably the number one question that I get asked. So if you've ever come across an orange wine, it's similar to rosé in the way that it's made. Rosé is just made with red grapes, So that gives it some of its color. Wine gets its color by having the juice and the skins spend time in contact. So an orange wine is basically a rosé, but for white wine grapes. Because when you do skin contact with the white wine grapes, it can turn into kind of an orangey amber hue.
Interesting.
All right. Well, it is 9 minutes past the hour, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up. Hate to, but Betty, come back.
Anytime.
As you said, you could talk about it for hours, and I think we could too. So thank you very much, Betty, sharing your expertise with us. That was a wonderful presentation and a great Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
And we'll see you all again soon.